Hey y'all, so in this video I'm going to show you how to take a face-to-face discussion-based lesson plan and convert it for a blended learning format. Some people also call this a hybrid format. So what do I mean by this? I mean a lesson in which you're using some asynchronous online components, right? Say discussion boards, blog posts, that sort of thing, and also some either face-to-face in-person components or some synchronous Zoom components, right? This lesson plan can work in either format, whether you're blending asynchronous with face-to-face or asynchronous with Zoom, right? And that's actually one of the reasons that I really like this particular transformation of this lesson plan is that it's really flexible. So say you're planning on teaching in face-to-face and for whatever reason have to move online, that if you have your course set up around these types of lessons, that actually becomes quite easy because you don't have to sort of move everything from face-to-face to asynchronous or asynchronous format. The structure, the scaffold is already there for you to transition more seamlessly. The other thing that's great about this particular format is that it kind of gives you some of the better accessibility of asynchronous to keep students who maybe can't make Zoom meetings or face-to-face meetings engaged in the course, and also some of those community building aspects of the synchronous or face-to-face elements, right? So it sort of can be a best of all worlds when you're trying to maximize your students' learning, okay? So just to give you a walkthrough of how the lesson plan usually runs when I do it in a face-to-face classroom. So the lesson plan is called Fables as Arguments, and the goal of the lesson plan is to get students to explore how creators use narrative techniques to send messages through stories, right? I don't think it's a hard thing to say that pretty much every story sends a message to us about how our culture works, what is valuable, what is not valuable, what is good, what is bad, all these sorts of things. And this lesson plan is designed to help students unlock those messages. It also helps students differentiate between intended and unintended messages. For example, one of the ones that they often grasp pretty quickly is that, for example, the intended message of a story like Beauty and the Beast is don't judge a book by its cover. But the unintended messages, I'm sure we could come up with several about the way that gender and romance play out in that story and whether or not viewers think that that is normal, right? So students latch on to those sorts of differences between intended and unintended messages pretty quickly. It also helps students practice basic analysis techniques that they're going to need throughout my course. I also do a soft introduction of ideas like context and how social and cultural context affects meaning and how audience affects meaning. So to start with context, for example, say we're talking about the fable Little Red Riding Hood, right? Most modern readers or viewers encounter this fable and go, oh, her mother tells her to stay on the path. She disobeys her mother and goes off the path, gets everybody eaten by a wolf, right? So the message then becomes, obey your mother, stay on the path, right? If we consider that when this fable was written, wolves were often symbols of sexually predatory men, the message becomes quite different, right? Instead of a message about obedience, it becomes a message about a young woman's responsibility to protect her own sexual purity in that society, right? The message becomes very, very different. So introducing students to the idea that when and where a story is told affects the message that readers or viewers might take away from it. We also introduce this idea of how audience affects message. So for example, students often talk about Finding Nemo in this lesson plan, right? And there's a pivotal moment in Finding Nemo where Nemo disobeys his father Marlin and swims out to a boat, touches the boat in a moment of defiance, and then is captured by a diver, right? Children might view this scene and go, oh yeah, Marlin told him not to go to the boat, he did anyway, and he got captured, he got kidnapped. Okay, obey my parents, right? That is the message. Whereas a parent might watch that movie and notice how Marlin has been sort of stifling Nemo, parenting him in such a way that Nemo feels no freedom and no ability to sort of create his own life or make his own choices. And that Nemo's act of rebellion is a reaction to Marlin's parenting style, right? So parents could take away a very different message from the exact same narrative moment. All right, so usually when I do this lesson plan face-to-face, it goes like this. we have an interactive lecture about what fables are and how they work, right? Usually I write, what is a fable, up on the board, and all the students sort of stare at me like, I'm not sure. And I say, can you think of an example? And one of them will raise their hand and say, tortoise and the hare, I think. And I go, yeah. And then we work our way, using tortoises and the hare as an example, we work our way through what is a fable and how does it work, right? Then I put them in small groups and they apply that fable framework to familiar stories, right? So I put them in groups of 3 or so and they find a story that they are all familiar with. Usually it's a children's movie, right? Like Finding Nemo, Shrek, these are all common. And they go, okay, if we think about this as a fable, what messages is it sending? And kids' movies work really well for this. Then we come back out into a big group and each group talks about which story they talked about, what messages they think the story is sending, and we draw connections and notice patterns among the different stories people talked about. Then I show them this sort of goofy German Christmas commercial in which we see a grandfather alone in his house year after year for Christmas. He has 3 children, but they're all living in far-flung places and too caught up in their own lives to come home for Christmas, right? So after, we're led to believe several years of this, he fakes his own death in order to get his children to come home. And then we go in small groups again and they talk about, okay, what messages is this sending? We come back and discuss, the intended message of family being very important and a thing to prioritize, and the unintended message of, yes, prioritize to the point where you lie, deceive, and scare the living bejesus out of your family in order to get them to do what you want, right? A sort of ends justifies the means kind of argument. So then we come back into that big group and discuss what they've thought about in their small groups. Okay, so that's how it runs in a face-to-face lesson. When I do it as a blended lesson, I separate it into asynchronous components that they do before class, and then components that we do in class or over Zoom. So, for example, that interactive lecture would instead be a video lecture. And I know that it can feel like there's a little bit of loss here, right? That interactive lecture isn't passive, right? It's active. The students are participating in it. And that's true. But the great thing about the video lecture is that students have a record of it. And actually for our students who might have trouble with sustaining attention or might not be auditory learners, right? Having that video that they can return to again and again as they need to in order to really digest the content is really good and actually held up by the pedagogical research as a really good practice. So even if you're doing maybe face-to-face lectures or Zoom lectures, it's good to record them and put them online anyway so that students have them and can refer to them as they need to. It will really improve their learning outcomes. Then I also have them, once they've watched the video lecture, join a discussion board about a familiar story. Now this might sound sort of strange, right? It doesn't have that element where they each get to get into their groups and pick what story they're talking about, right? But I'm doing it this way because group work in the time of coronavirus becomes quite fraught, right? It's hard. Can they socially distance while they're doing their group work? It becomes kind of dicey, right? So I moved this group work component online, and I want to talk to you a moment about the exact way that I do this. I don't know about you, but in my pedagogical life, I have used and abused discussion boards and used them in all the wrong ways, frankly. Oftentimes when I create a discussion board on Icon, it is more like a written reflection, right? I give them a prompt and then I say, write 250 to 300 words. Oh, and by the way, maybe also comment on someone else's, right? And those requirements really lead to the discussion board feeling more like a writing assignment and less like a conversation, right? It's more like a blog. Discussion boards aren't really designed to be used that way. They're designed to be a much more informal space. So instead of having this significant word count that in the past I felt like I've needed in order to make sure students achieve a certain depth of thought, I'm going to keep it as this informal space where I say, okay, join the discussion board where you're going to analyze as a group this story that you're all familiar with, and make sure that you are contributing thoughtfully, 4 or 5 times. And I'm going to grade it either based solely on completion or even to go a step further, more holistically, the way that I grade participation, right? So I might look through their discussion posts and give them a discussion post grade every 3 or 4 weeks, right? to show them that there is a standard, they do have to be thoughtful, right? But I'm not sort of checking to make sure they've got commas in the right place, right? I'm not worried about that. And the reason that this is important is that it keeps the discussion boards as those conversational spaces that allow students to form community with their peers, right? They're discussing the material, but they're doing it in an informal way. And this really promotes community, and that's so important for classes that are online or blended because it's harder to create that community, obviously, in these formats than it is in face-to-face formats. And the reason that discussion boards used this way work so well for this is that any community that you can think of has both formal and informal modes, right? Church, classrooms, clubs, right? Have time where the participants are all working together in a sort of, strictly outlined activity, and times when people are just, milling around before things get started or after things die down, right? And every good community needs both those formal and informal spaces. So for example, if you're doing this in a format that has asynchronous and Zoom components, you don't have that time before class starts or after class ends, where everyone's just sort of in the room together, but things haven't gotten going, right? A discussion board can be an informal space, right, where students can just chat to each other about the material, being thoughtful, but also being fairly conversational, right? And doing that this way creates and maintains that informal space. And grading it either based on completion or more holistically will help that as well. The other thing about how I run these discussion boards is that I don't just have one discussion board that all 20 students in my class participate in, right? Instead, what I do is I give them 4 discussion boards that they self-select into, right? So when I say join a discussion about a familiar story, I'll have one for Beauty and the Beast, one for Finding Nemo, one for Frozen, right? And maybe I'll put the 4th one as a sort of choose your own story, right? And whoever gets to the discussion board first gets to dictate what the story is, right? And by doing that and allowing students to self-select into which discussion board they're participating in, that also ups community, because the pedagogical research shows that in online learning or blended learning, creating smaller cohorts of students fosters more community when they're interacting with 4 or 5 of their peers rather than all 20 at once. This also will up participation because when you're in a smaller group, you feel that social pressure to participate more, right? For example, students that don't participate at all in a 20-person class, if you're in a group with just 4 of them, they'll participate, right? They'll feel that social pressure. So dividing them into groups or letting them self-select into groups for these discussion boards is a really good strategy. Now, for the in-class portion, what I'll do is I'll read the discussion boards, or at least skim through them, before I walk into class, and then when we have discussion, I'll ask students to talk about what they posted in their discussion boards, and I'll also be able to do that work that I would normally do in a face-to-face class if students were working in small groups and they're reporting out, which is that I'll draw connections. I'll say, oh yeah, this thing got brought up on the Beauty and the Beast discussion board, and I think it really relates to this other idea that got brought up on the Finding Nemo discussion board, right? So I'm making those connections for them, helping them take their ideas deeper and notice patterns, right? So we would have this big discussion about what they posted in their discussion boards. We would watch the German Christmas commercial, and then we would discuss and analyze those intended and unintended messages as a group. Now, I am losing that small group component, you'll notice, right? I have them in the face-to-face lesson plan do small groups between watching the commercial and the big group discussion. But like I said, small groups are kind of hard in the time of COVID-19. So because the German Christmas commercial, frankly, isn't that difficult, most of them latch on to the ideas and how it functions as a fable pretty readily, that we can get away with not having those small group discussions before the students feel confident sharing their own ideas. All right? Thanks so much for watching. If you're interested in seeing how this lesson plan could be adapted to either a synchronous Zoom format or an asynchronous format on Canvas, then feel free to check out those videos that we have as well. Thanks.